Hello, welcome to day 3 of this online course on astronomy. Today we are going to be talking about the physics of stars. Like you see in the background, there's this painting by Van Gogh, The Starry, Starry Nights, where stars have basically fascinated people from time immemorial. And stars is the basic content of astronomy. So most of you all would belong to this generation who did see Lion King either as children or as parents. And if you remember, there's a conversation between Timon and Pumbaa, where Pumbaa asked Timon, ever wonder what those sparkly dots are up there? Timon says, Pumbaa, I don't wonder, I know. Pumbaa says, oh, what are they? So Timon says, they are fireflies that just got stuck in that bluish black thing. Pumbaa, oh gee, I always thought they were balls of gas burning billions of miles away. Timon says, Pumbaa, with you, everything's gas. And I'm sure people who've seen the movie know the reference to this joke. But actually, Pumbaa is not wrong, because what you see, that stars are they're actually big balls of gas with fusion going on at the center, held together by gravity. So you could have different kinds of stars. You could have massive stars, you could have sun-like stars, you could have low-mass stars. There are variations in the stars, but by and large, they're pretty simple things. Like I said, they are big balls of gas with fusion. Now, we are already aware of what is nuclear fusion. Typically, in our nuclear energy sources, we have what is nuclear fission, where we actually take heavy atoms, for example, uranium-235, and we break it down into smaller pieces, right? Which is nuclear fission. Nuclear fusion is actually the synthesis of lighter elements to give you heavier elements. So here in this case, you have hydrogen giving you helium. And this is what we called nuclear fusion. And typically in stars, what is actually happening is the process of nuclear fusion, where we synthesize hydrogen to give you helium. And what happens is when the synthesis takes place, the binding energy, which is the mass of this resultant helium, is actually smaller than the constituent masses. And the difference in mass is called the mass defect. So the amount of energy given out is the binding energy, which is the mass defect, into c squared. And that's essentially the energy source of stars, nuclear fusion. Now, when you look up at stars, what are the properties that you notice? The first thing you can say is there's a difference in brightness, and also there's a difference in color. Now, what is brightness? Brightness is basically the luminosity of the star. And how do we, the sizes of stars, stars can also have different kinds of sizes. They could be bigger or smaller than the sun. And there's a whole range of sizes, right? So if you were to take sun compared to Sirius, Sirius is the brightest star in our sky after the sun. You'll see the sun is so much smaller. But if it's compared to other stars, it's much smaller than that, compared to Arcturus and Aldebaran. Compared to Betelgeuse, which is the red giant star in Orion, many of you all would be familiar with it. And compared to the others, you can see Betelgeuse is so small. So you have a whole range of sizes of stars. The colors of stars also can vary, and like they could be reddish or bluish or yellowish, depending upon the kind of star it is. So how do we exactly understand stars? Now, in theory, there is something called the Russell-Watt theorem, which basically includes the properties of mass and chemical composition of stars. And in terms of observations, we have what is called the Hertzsprung-Russell diagram, which basically unifies the luminosity and temperature of stars. Now, today we are going to talk more about the Hertzsprung-Russell diagram, because this basically relates the observational properties of stars, which is luminosity and temperature. So what is the HR diagram? The HR diagram is a plot, basically, of the absolute brightness or the luminosity of stars on the y-axis versus the temperature or the spectral class of stars on the x-axis. Now we'll see where are most stars in this HR diagram and how do stars actually evolve over the HR diagram, and what does the HR diagram of a star cluster tell us. These are the things we're going to talk about in this talk. Now, what is the basic problem that we have? If we try to understand the life of a star, right, it's actually very similar to a mosquito trying to understand human life, right? So, for example, you're looking at this bunch of people over here, and you're this mosquito over here, and how will this mosquito be able to figure out the life cycle of these human beings? Now, why is it basically difficult? Because, for example, for a mosquito, a male mosquito lives for about 10 days, a female one for 42 to 56 days. So if you actually see in terms of human life, a human life is about 3,000 mosquito lives, right? If we assume that the human being lives for about 80 days, right? So I've made a basic calculation over here, human being living for 80 days into 365 divided by 10. If I take a male mosquito, so if a male mosquito decides to now study a human life is about 3,000 times the age of a male mosquito. Stellar life in comparison is not 3,000, but it's about 100. It could be, I mean, stellar lives can range from 1,000,000 years to 1,000,000,000 years. That is 10 power 6 to 10 power 9 years. So typically, if you actually take 10 power 9, then in that case, you actually have a stellar life being about, you have so many more human lives, right? So therefore, well, the problem is we cannot sit back and watch and look at a human being, I mean, a star being born and dying. We have to basically use the laws of physics and a few observational quantities to actually understand the lives of stars, because we cannot live through the lifetime of a star to actually decipher its life process, right? And let's say now the mosquito who's decided to study human beings tries to observe properties for human beings. So what are the properties this mosquito would see? The properties would see the color of hair, height, weight, age. Age is also not too easy. How would the mosquito know your age? But various other properties that the mosquito would see in a person. And the mosquito would try to actually check what are the major properties that actually define a human life cycle. And what do we notice in people when we want to assess, for example, their age? Like I said, age of a person is not a very trivial thing to assess. So let's try to make a human HR. Supposing we try to make a Hertzsprung-Russell diagram, the crucial parameters. Let's say the crucial parameter for a human being is age, right? But what can we observe? We can't observe the age. So we can observe the height and the weight. So let's say we make a height-weight plot of human beings, right? So we plot height versus weight of human beings. Here's the height, here's the weight. So we see that when this mosquito observes a whole bunch of human beings, he sees some human beings with smaller heights and lesser weights. These, as we know, are our children. And then the bulk of the human beings, he sees lying between 1.5 to 2 meters height, and the range of weight could say range from about 40 to 80 kgs. And that's, so B to C is what we'd call adulthood, which would be the adults which the mosquito observes. And A to B is the range where the mosquito observes children, right? So children basically belong to the range where you have smaller heights and smaller weights, and it has this. And so then the mosquito can actually make two categories of human beings. So it says that the less denser part or the less populated region of this height weight diagram are children, which lie between A and B. And the more populated part of this diagram is B to C, where you have basically adults. And because there are more points over here, the mosquito can infer that the bulk of human beings lie between the region B to C. And this is what the mosquito can also call adulthood, which is the B to C region, while a smaller set of human beings lie in the A to B region, which we call child, but the mosquito can call whatever. Now, similarly, which is actually pretty good, because the mosquito has actually understood that bulk of people lie between B to C. This is adulthood. This is some transitionary phase for human beings A to B. And it could actually decipher that this is a kind of process taking place, right? With stars, what happens is, like I said, from theory, we know the two important parameters for stars are mass and chemical composition. And from observations, we know it is luminosity and temperature, right? So the HR diagram basically uses luminosity and temperature, which are the two important parameters for stars. So for stars, similarly to human beings, like how that's exactly how we decipher people's age, etc., by looking at their height and weight. Similarly for stars, we basically look at their luminosity and their temperature, right? And that is, the plot of that is what we call the HR diagram. And in the next talk, you will actually see that stellar evolution also can be very well described by movement on the HR diagram. Right? So what is intensity? So we've already spoken about intensity and magnitude scales on the first day where we did basics of these things, where you saw that basically 5 magnitudes. We have a magnitude scale to describe the brightness of stars, and 5 magnitudes corresponds to 100 factor in intensity. So, stars which differ by 5 magnitudes, they basically differ in brightness by 100 times. And therefore, if I put it as 100 to the power of 1 by 5 is 2.52. And therefore, the intensities vary in this form. Yi by Ib is 2.512 to the power of the magnitude of star B minus the magnitude of star A. The other important factor which we need to know for stars is what is called parallax. Now, parallax is something which we evaluate all the while. When you look at basically something at a distance, the fact that we have two eyes, okay, gives us a perspective of depth. That means when we look at, if you look at the upper figure, you have two men over here. You have this man who looks at the height of this tree and sees it reaches this peak. The man over here looks at the height of the tree and sees it reaches this peak. And therefore, if we measure this angle over here, we know the distance between these two people, we can actually decipher the height of the tree. Now, this is actually what we do when we, with our two eyes. That is why two eyes are essential to get three-dimensional depth in vision. So what we actually do is when we look through our two eyes, we actually find the angle subtended between the two eyes to a faraway object. And that is what is used to find out the distance. And this is done very automatically by our brain. You can test this by actually closing an eye. If you close an eye and then ask your friend to put a finger, it would actually be difficult for you to touch the tip of that finger with only one eye open, right? Because you won't know the concept of depth. And hence two eyes are very essential to get depth using the method which is called parallax. Now, parallax can be used, like in this case, you have two men standing over here to use this. We are actually, the problem is our baseline. That means the distance between the two eyes. And so that's good for deciphering the distance between close by objects. But if we want to look at further objects, we need to basically increase our baseline so that we can look at further objects. Now, one good way of increasing the baseline is supposing we take the position of the Earth and change it by 6 months. So for example, while the Earth is going around its orbit, we actually take the position of a certain star in January and get it to be something like this. In July, when we observe the same thing, we take it to be this. Our baseline has increased. This is one astronomical unit, which is 150 million kilometers, the distance between the Earth and the Sun. And what we actually do is using this baseline, we can calculate the parallax angle and find out the distance to a star. So therefore, distance gets defined as 1 upon the parallax angle in arc seconds if the distance is given in parsecs. So we have a scale of distance parsecs, which has also been introduced to you on the day 1. And that basically gets defined about the parallax angle. So what we do is for nearby stars, we basically measure the parallax angle to those nearby stars, and they can be used to actually find out the distance to nearby stars, the parallax, which is very important because the brightness, if you actually look, it is the brightness of the star obviously changes as the square of the distance, right? So therefore, it is very essential for us to know the distance to a star to actually know its real intrinsic magnitude or intrinsic brightness. Otherwise, you could have a bright star at varying distances from us, which appears to be bright because it's close by or far away, right? And based on this, this has already been done on the first day. We have what is called the apparent magnitude scale. That is, what is the brightness of a star from the distance to the Earth when we do not know the distance. Then we call that the apparent magnitude. That is the apparent brightness of a star. So the apparent magnitude scale you can see over here. On this scale, if you see the sun has an apparent magnitude of -26. The full moon has an apparent magnitude of -13. And you have different telescopes. For example, if you have a typical 1 meter telescope, it can actually look for stars with an apparent brightness of 20 magnitudes. The Hubble Space Telescope looks at 30 magnitude. The Keck telescopes also do that. And this is the apparent magnitude scale. So like I mentioned before, if you have two stars, B and A, at two different distances, so the luminosity of A divided by the luminosity of B, if I take the 2.5 times log of that, I can get the difference in magnitudes. So that's the apparent magnitude scale. The absolute magnitude scale is what we do is we actually move stars such that they are all at the same distance. So let's put all stars at a distance of 10 parsecs, right? If we put all stars at a distance of 10 parsecs and we measure their brightness, that's what we call their absolute magnitude. Now, the absolute magnitude is essential because if you have objects of different brightness, you'd obviously place them at the same distance so that you can compare their intrinsic brightnesses. And that's what we do when we measure the absolute magnitude scale, right? So what we do is we convert the apparent magnitude of stars to the absolute magnitude. So now the MB minus MA is replaced by apparent magnitude minus absolute magnitude. And here instead I have the difference which is coming because of the distance, right? So this is my distance, but my distance has to be in parsecs. So obviously if my distance is 10, if I put it as 10 parsecs, then log of 10 is 1. So minus 5 plus 5 is 0 and M is equal to M. That means the apparent magnitude is equal to the absolute magnitude at a distance of 10 parsecs, right? And depending upon the distance of the star, you could have the apparent magnitude less than or greater than the absolute magnitude. Please remember, in the magnitude scale, we have reverse magnitudes. That means a larger number, if your magnitude is 10, a 10 magnitude star is fainter than a 5 magnitude star, right? So the difference in M minus M is what we call the distance modulus. Another property of stars is stars also have velocities, okay? There could be a velocity of the star, which is the radial velocity, which is called the velocity in our line of sight, okay? This is also what is called the Doppler velocity, which I spoke to you about yesterday when we did the same formula, delta lambda by lambda is VR by C. So what we do is if we want to measure the radial velocity of stars, we basically see the spectral shift, the shift in the spectral line, that is delta lambda by lambda, and that is used to find out the velocity of a star. The tangential velocity is the component in the line of sight. So radial velocity is along your line of sight, while tangential velocity is perpendicular to the line of sight. And the tangential velocity. So the tangential velocity is basically given by 4.74 mu into d. We won't talk about that now, we'll do it a little later. Where mu is actually the proper motion, right? So if you know the proper motion of stars, right, which is the shift in a star with a certain time frame, that is, if you measure the position of a star today and measure it after 50 years, you will see a slight difference in the position, which is called the proper motion. So we can convert that to tangential velocities by taking a factor of 4.74 into the proper motion into this thing. This is just got by conversions, okay? When you conversion your arc seconds to years to kilometers per second, you will get these factors. So the space velocity of the star is the root of the square of the sum of the squares of both these velocities, and that will give me the space velocity of stars. Now, how do I get the luminosity of stars? So the luminosity of stars is basically, it depends upon two factors. One thing is you can see that there is the flux, which is sigma. Sigma is the Stephen-Boltzmann's constant into t to the power of 4, okay? Now the area of the star, the total surface area of a star is 4 pi r squared. And therefore the luminosity of a star is given to me by the area, 4 pi r squared, if it's a sphere, which we assume it is, into Stephen-Boltzmann's constant into t to the power of 4. So that is the formula for the luminosity of a star. What about the temperature? How do we measure the temperature of stars, right? Now, one way of finding the temperature of stars is to assume that stars are black body radiators, okay? I'll talk to you what are black bodies. A black body is an ideal emitter and an absorber, and we can use that to find out the temperature of stars. Now, how do we do that? Supposing, for example, we pass white light through a spectrum, through a prism, sorry. What we get out is called the spectrum. What is the spectrum? That white light has components in it, different colors, and all of them have different refractive indexes. And therefore, when it passes through the spectrum, you have a spread of colors or the spectrum of this white light, right? Now, if we actually look at electromagnetic radiation, light which comes to us, it covers a whole range of wavelengths, okay? They could be very short wavelengths, which are the gamma rays and the X-rays. Then you have these rays, and then you go in for microwaves, infrared radiation, micro radiation, and radio waves. Now, our eyes are detectors which can only detect radiation falling in this range, okay, which is the range of visible light, which is the VIBGYOR. We do not see these other radiations with our eyes. We can only see this amount of radiation with our eyes, right? But what happens is if here I have a plot of what is called a black body spectrum. So if you actually remember in this, you can have a whole range of wavelengths. Like I mentioned, only a certain part of this is observed by our eyes, which is optical light. So if you have a radiator or a hot body, it basically emits radiation in all wavelengths. So from wavelength 0 to infinity, it radiates all wavelengths. And if this body is a black body, then in that case, the radiation which comes out from this body falls up a curve of this kind. Okay, this black curve which you see is the curve which is given by black bodies. So it's called the black body spectrum. Only some part of it is what is seen by our eyes, is the visible light, right? So for example, if you look at the radiation which comes from the sun also can be approximated to be a black body radiator. And in that case, what you see is that the peak of the sun radiation comes in this part, which is the yellow part, right? So you know that the sun appears yellow to us because the peak of solar radiation is in yellow light. So if I fit this to a black body spectrum, where the peak is coming in the yellow color of the light, I can actually find out the temperature of the surface of the sun, right? So I know that the sun is peaking in yellow light, right? And I draw a black body curve which peaks in yellow light. And that black body curve has a temperature of 5,800 degrees Kelvin. So I can say that the surface of the sun has a temperature of 5,800 degrees Kelvin. How do I get this curve? Is I basically measure the amount of intensity of light I get from the sun in different wavelengths. So I get some points, 1, 2, 3, 4. I get some points of this spectrum, fit it to a black body spectrum, and get the temperature of the sun, which is 5,800. So that is the way in which we can actually find out the temperature of an object. Let's say you have a black body which passes through a cloud of cold gas. If it passes, I directly have the hot body, I pass it through the spectrum, I get this different amount of radiation in different colors. And that's nothing but points on this black body spectrum. That means I'll get some points which tell me what is the brightness at different wavelengths from the spectrum, right? So the spectrum basically gives me the different points on different wavelengths. And this is called a continuous spectrum. You could also have the hot body through which the light passes through some cloud of colder gas. Then it passes through a spectrum. So then what happens is you could actually have what is called an absorption spectrum. That means there could be parts of this radiation which is absorbed by the colder gas, due to which you have an absence of radiation at certain wavelengths. And this is called an absorption spectrum. You could also have hot gas which actually gives you radiation in certain wavelengths, which is called an emission line spectrum. So what we basically do is we look for the spectrum of light which comes from hot bodies. One part of it is the continuous spectrum, and some part of it could be absorption lines. That is where you have a lack of intensity in certain lines, and some could be emission lines where you have an excess. So let us see this again. You can look at this is a spectrum of the sun. You can see at some wavelengths I have an excess of radiation. This is my emission line. And here you see I have a certain fall in radiation. So this is my absorption lines. So my absorption lines is where I have lesser amount of emission, and the emission lines is where I have an excess of emission from the sun, for example. And this is used, like I said, to find the temperature. Now, how do we get the bolometric magnitudes of stars? So if we want to know the bolometric magnitudes, that is the total amount of flux coming from the star. So to get this bolometric this thing, you actually have to observe the star at all wavelengths. Obviously, you won't be able to observe it at all wavelengths. So what we do is we observe it at certain wavelengths, fit it to a black body spectrum, and use that to actually get a bolometric. So what are you basically doing is you get these points at certain points. So I measure it over here, I measure over here, I measure over here, and I measure over here. I use this to actually fit it and get a curve which satisfies the points I measure. Um, Now to do this more effectively, we have what are called photometric filters or systems which are used in astronomy. So what we do is the light coming from a star, we pass it through a filter and we measure its brightness. Okay. So there are some filters which are in ultraviolet, in blue, in visible light, and we use this to basically measure. So you have filters, for example, in ultraviolet, in blue, in visual. The ultraviolet filter has an approximately 3,600 angstrom peak. The blue filter is at 4,400. The violet one is at 5,500. So we actually measure or we sample the brightness of stars at these different filters or at different wavelengths. And for example, if you take the difference in the blue filter and the V filter, we can call that MB minus MV. And that is also what is called the color of a star. So for example, we measure the brightness of a star in the B filter, measure the brightness in the V filter, and the difference is what we call the color. Now, standardization is done in astronomy by using a star called Vega. And for Vega, we say the B minus V color is 0. This is how we define it to be. Now here, if we plot for stars, let's say now we know the brightness and we know the distance of a star. We also know its color. So we use the color to find out the temperature, which you can see over here. If we plot this, we see this is the kind of plot we get. And this is what we call the HR diagram. So you can see the bulk of stars sits over here. So this is adulthood for a star. That means the bulk of the time is spent by stars in this region. This is also called the main sequence. You have some stars in this region over here and some stars in this region over here too, right? So the HR diagram, if we do the main sequence, it comes over here. Now, if you also, if we talk about how we find out the masses of stars, if we were to find out the masses of the stars, we would see that they occupy these kind of places on the HR diagram, right? So we said that most stars lie along the main sequence. And if we were to see the masses move in this kind of a way. Now, how do we, this is another plot of the HR diagram using the Hipparchus, where we use the magnitude versus the color. This is the difference in brightness in two different filters, the visual filter, and there is what is called the I-band filter. Using this, you can actually plot an HR diagram. So this is the main sequence of stars. And this one is another part of this thing where we have a lot of stars. What are these stars? We'll talk about them just now. So now let's say the HR diagram is a reflection of this luminosity relation which we have, which is sigma 4 pi r squared into t power 4, right? If I were to plot the sun on the HR diagram, we'll get the sun on this. So we can actually see that the sun is a main sequence star. So it's an adult star, and that is why we do not see much of a variation in the sun. This is the part of the life of a star when the star is most stable. The star stays here for a long time and with stable brightness, and that is very essential for the evolution of the humankind. And hence a main sequence star really makes life most easy for us. We also see other stars in these regions. Stars over here, these stars are what are called supergiants. These are stars which basically, they have the same temperature. If you were to measure the temperature of these stars have the same temperature, for example, like the sun, for example, the giant stars, but they have a higher brightness. And if you remember our formula, which is luminosity is equal to sigma 4 pi r squared t power 4, we say that these are basically brighter for the simple reason that the R value is brighter, is larger. And therefore, these stars are much more luminous with the same temperature because the R value is larger. These stars, in contrast, they have a lower luminosity, but a good temperature, a high temperature, but they basically lose out on luminosity because of the R factor. So they have smaller radii, and hence these are called dwarfs. So these are the main sequence stars. Here we have our giants, and here we have our dwarfs. So what you see is stars are also divided in what are called luminosity classes, basically depending upon the sizes. So the brightest stars, you can see if I slice it from here, are called the supergiants, the giants, the main sequence stars, and the dwarfs. And so these are the more brighter stars. And therefore you can see these brighter stars are the ones over here. And that's basically because their radii are very large. Note over here you have the magnitude scale. Brighter stars have negative magnitude. Like I mentioned earlier, the magnitude scale is a reverse scale. So having a negative magnitude means the star is much brighter. Now stars are also divided in what are called spectral classes depending upon their brightness or their heat. Sorry, depending on their temperature. And therefore these spectral classes are defined as O, B, A, F, G, K, M. So typically an O-type star is a very hot star, while for example an M-type star is a cold star, right? If we were to actually look at stars in a sphere of 33 light years, you'll see that the bulk of stars have a luminosity like this. This is as a function of the luminosity of the sun, right? So you have a larger number of lower luminosity stars compared to high luminosity stars. Nature builds them in such a way that there are more low luminosity stars than high luminosity stars. High luminosity stars are not many. They are much smaller, lesser in number compared to low luminosity stars. So if you actually look over here, hot stars are very bright, but they are very rare. They do not affect they can affect the light of the galaxy, but not the mass of the galaxy. While red giants are more common, there are lots of stars over here, and more common are red dwarfs. Right? So the HR diagram, let's sum up what we learned, that stars in the upper right of the diagram are very large, they're the giants, lower left are very small, and therefore this defines not only the size, but also the mass of the stars. The branch of the stars to the upper right is the giant and supergiants, and temperature increases to the left, luminosity to the right. So we actually look at families of stars. These are our main sequence stars. These are the more massive main sequence stars. These are the low mass main sequence stars. Here we have our supergiants. Here we have the giants. Here we have our white dwarfs. And that's how the families of stars are placed. Now, it's very difficult to essentially measure the mass of a star, and it's basically done for binary stars. In binary systems, what happens is you basically have two stars which are moving around each other, around their center of mass. And so if you very accurately can measure the time periods of these binaries through light curves, like we did yesterday when we did exoplanets, you can actually get the mass ratios and get the masses of these stars. And therefore, in certain cases, we can find out the masses of stars. We also see that there is a direct relationship between the masses and the luminosities of stars. So for main sequence stars, there is what is called a mass-luminosity relationship. So if you can see that as the mass of stars increases, the luminosity also of these stars increase, right? So once we know the luminosity of a star, we can also measure its mass if it's a main sequence star, right? So what happens is if we place it over here, like I mentioned here, we have our supergiants. These are blue because the blue side is this, which is hotter. The red side is this, which is colder. So these are all colder stars. These are hotter stars. Our blue supergiants are sitting over here. The dwarfs, like you can see, these are hot, right? Hence they are bluish, right? But they are not so bright. They are fainter in luminosity. Here we have our main sequence stars. Here is the sun being a main sequence star. Here we have the giants sitting over here, and we have the dwarfs sitting in this region. So if you actually were to see the HR diagram, temperature goes this way, luminosity goes this way, mass goes this way, and size goes this way. So if you can actually see, these stars are more massive than these stars, but these stars are more bigger in size than these stars, right? So we have massive stars over here and larger stars over here, right? So what we can actually see is that the HR diagram, that means if we effectively measure the luminosity and temperature of a star, we can directly determine its mass as well as its size, right? And hence the HR diagram is considered the key to understanding properties of a star. If you know the position of a star on the HR diagram, you will directly know its mass and you will know its radius, right? The next thing will be about the age of stars, and that will be in the following talk, which will be talking about the evolution of stars. And then we will talk about how, by positioning a star on the HR diagram, you can directly also get the age of stars and determine the evolution of stars. In the sense, you can actually say what is actually going to happen to a given star once you know its position on the HR diagram. Like I said, once again, for the HR diagram, you need to know its luminosity, you need to know its temperature. So I'll end up with this. This is part 1. And part 2 will be continued by Professor Hassan, which will be on the evolution of stars on the HR diagram. But for that, it's very important to understand what is the HR diagram. And that's what we've seen in this episode. Thank you.